Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining this important conversation about the devastating LA County wildfires. Today, we'll hear from UCLA experts on the origin of these events and their impact on us and our environment. My name is Alex Hall, and I'm a climate scientist here at UCLA. For the past 2 years, I've been serving as the director of UCLA's Sustainable LA Grand Challenge, which is a campus-wide incubator for sustainability research initiatives. Just a few days before the wildfires broke out, I was also appointed director of UCLA's Institute of the Environment and Sustainability, which is an interdisciplinary teaching and research institute that aims to translate environmental research into action. As the director now of both the Sustainable LA Grand Challenge and the Institute of the Environment and Sustainability, I am committed to positioning UCLA as an international leader in sustainability research and education. We have a responsibility to leverage our tremendous intellectual resources to provide decision makers with societally relevant, evidence-based knowledge. A concrete example of this type of effort is our Climate and Wildfire Research Initiative, something my team and I launched a couple of years ago. The goal here is to develop knowledge, tools, and modes of thinking to confront our rapidly evolving wildfire challenge. We've already mobilized 2 working groups composed of top scholars. One is focused on the mental and physical health impacts of wildfire, and the other concerns Southern California's unique vegetation and fire dynamics. In response to the recent fires, we are also moving quickly to build more targeted research teams focused on the newly emerging challenges of Southern California fires. The tragic start to 2025 has underscored the urgency of our work. The climate is changing, and the wildfire crisis is unfortunately only one consequence of this new and evolving reality. Of course, none of this would be possible without our UCLA community, and I want to take a moment to acknowledge just how vital you are to our work. We're here today to learn, but we're also here to gather. I know how difficult the past 2 weeks have been for all of us, and I'm personally so grateful for the opportunity to connect with you all here. With that, let me hand it over to Nurit Katz. Nurit is UCLA's Chief Sustainability Officer, and she's been the mastermind behind our campus's ongoing transformation towards sustainability. Nurit is also just an amazing human. She's an educator, an urban ecologist, and a talented birdwatcher and photographer. She'll be moderating our discussion with my esteemed colleagues, and I'll let her introduce them. Nurit?
Thank you so much, Alex, and our panelists can join us at this time. I'll be introducing folks for some starter remarks, and then we'll have a moderated conversation with all of us that will be based on questions that everyone shared. So thank you all so much. We have so many attendees here tonight. We did our best to try to take those questions and bring them into the questions that we'll be discussing here tonight. And then towards the end, we'll also hopefully have a little time for some live Q&A as well. So you can put any additional questions you have in the Q&A below. So for our introductions, we're going to start with Yifang Zhu. She is Associate Director of the UCLA's Institute of Environment and Sustainability's Center for Clean Air, a very important topic to all of us right now. She's also a professor of environmental health sciences at the Fielding School of Public Health. So Yifang, you've done a lot of work on measuring and modeling air pollutant emissions, transport, and transformation, as well as assessing and mitigating the associated health effects. Can you tell us a little bit about how your current research relates to the fire situation that we're facing?
Yeah, sure. Thank you, Norris. I'm very happy to be here with this panel and share my insights about what's going on with the air. So my research focuses generally in the area of climate change, air pollution, environmental exposure assessment, and associated health effects. In the context of this LA fires that is currently still ongoing, I'm particularly interested in understanding the unique toxicity of the resulting smoke, because there's a large number of structures get burned, which is very different from typical vegetation wildfires. So the smoke may contain some volatile organic compounds, some of which are carcinogens, very harmful to our health. And they can also contain a lot of fine particulate matters. We call them PM 2.5, that has been linked to all sorts of different adverse health effects, and toxic heavy metals that are emitted from building materials, electronics, or industry components. It's all together. And adding to this complexity of the toxicity of smoke and exposures is the issue of indoor air quality, which is also my specialty. This is an often overlooked issue in ongoing wildfire research because people spend majority of our time indoors, particularly during wildfire, because the public, advertises and advises to stay indoors. So indoor environment play a very important role in affecting exposures and associated health effects. So over the past 2 weeks, we've been very busy. We have deployed both indoor and outdoor samplers at multiple locations in West LA and the Pasadena areas. We collect some samples and hoping to analyze those for toxic metals and volatile organic compounds. Currently, we're actually in the middle of the second round sample collection. This time we're focused on homes that were evacuated, but now have been repopulated back to their home, but in fire impacted area. This is also important because exposure can still occur during the post-fire period as degassing may continue long after the fire has been contained. And of course, we're actively seeking funding to analyze those samples so that we can share the data with the public in a timely manner. With that, I'll turn it back to you.
Thank you so much. This is such critical work, and we look forward to more of your expertise this evening. Our next panelist is Greg Pierce. Greg is Research and Co-Executive Director of the Luskin Center for Innovation. He is also faculty in the Department of Urban Planning and an affiliate of the Institute of Environment and Sustainability, or IoES, including directing the UCLA Water Resources Group. So Greg, you've done extensive research and planning for governance in water systems in LA specifically, as well as focusing on affordability, quality, and accessibility of water. Can you please tell us a little bit about the work you're doing right now that relates to the LA fires?
Yeah, thanks, Nurit, and thanks to everyone for joining. And good to be here with my colleagues and fellow panelists. We have jumped in to trying to support efforts around understanding and really relief and recovery at the intersection of water supply systems and the wildfires in 4 ways. One, I know I'll talk about later, is just helping folks understand and really combat disinformation around the role that water supply systems play in combating wildfire. And that really has been a unique aspect, I would say, of how these wildfires have been perceived. The second is around, and again, I know we'll talk about this more later, the impact of wildfires on drinking water quality, which is a particularly complex sort of question to answer, given we're talking about at least 3 major fires and 10 to 15 different water systems. And the answers to questions are changing, by the hour or by the day with some of these systems. The third that we're starting to work on, and we'll be working on, I think, in the coming months and years, is thinking about how water systems can be better equipped to fight wildfires. There's a lot of questions, limitations to that, and certainly changes in expectations around that have come from these fires. But there are certainly, I don't think there's much low-hanging fruit, but there's medium-hanging fruit. And then there are some drastic things we might contemplate to do to better equip water systems to fight wildfires in the future. But that brings us to sort of the 4th thing that we're looking at and working on, which is that none of these things are cheap. And in fact, all of them are expensive. Some of them that people talk about are at the limits of technical feasibility. But if we really want to think about, making water systems as resilient as we can to fight wildfires, which itself won't solve the problem, that's incredibly expensive. And we've got to think about how we're going to pay for that and who's going to pay for that. So that's an overview of what we're up to right now.
Thank you so much, Greg. Alex, you introduced yourself earlier in your different roles that you have right now and in leadership. You're one of the nation's leading experts on climate change. You've worked extensively to understand what climate change means for our future, as well as extensive work on wildfire. Can you please tell us a little bit about the work that you're doing right now that's relevant to our current crisis?
Yeah, so I do a lot of work trying to create very high resolution simulations of the climate, and we had for the past 5 years developed a set of simulations for the entire Western US. And one thing that we jumped into right away as these fires were evolving is looking at the future of the Santa Ana wind events and how they might change in their behavior in terms of their frequency and their intensity, and also the humidity during the events and how it might evolve going forward. We're also collaborating with some wildfire behavior scientists trying to understand the relationship between the Santa Ana winds and wildfire behavior so that we can do a much better job at predicting the impact of Santa Ana winds on wildfires and how they evolve. And we know Santa Anas are important for wildfire behavior, but we really want to get down to very granular levels, looking at how different canyons are impacted by the different flavors of Santa Ana winds, and so that we can do a much better job, predicting where the risk is really elevated when we do have a Santa Ana wind event. So that's just giving you a sampling of the types of things that we have jumped into, as a result of these really devastating events.
Thank you so much. And I think we'll dive right in because that's definitely a topic that was of interest to many of our attendees, which is really, how we can make sense of the climate conditions that contributed to these devastating fires and whether these kinds of events are going to increase with climate change, and will we actually be able to predict any of these conditions to help us prepare for these kinds of devastating events in the future?
Yeah, it's actually a question that preoccupied us a lot as these events occurred, and we partnered with some colleagues in geography, Park Williams and his postdoc, and some other folks to try to unpack the role that climate change might play in this event. This was something that we did. We kind of rolled up our sleeves just in the day or two afterwards and worked day and night to try to answer that question. And we found that the Santa Ana wind event itself was about a 1 in 20 year event. So it was definitely a rare Santa Ana event, but not totally unprecedented. And another factor that was really important was the unusual dry start to our wet season. So typically we get our first rains sometime in November, and we haven't had any rain yet. A little bit in the forecast, hopefully, but haven't had any rain yet. And that is, quite an unusual thing. And that's not totally unprecedented, but probably something like a 1 in 50 year event. So we were pretty unlucky in the sense that we had a 1 in 20 year event coincide with a 1 in 50 year event. At the same time, the fuels were really dry. The vegetation was incredibly dry. And that's really where climate change probably has played a role, because we had a really unusually warm and dry summer. And that probably dried out the fuels a lot more than they would have been otherwise. So that's our best assessment, is that because of that warm and hot summer, which we think is mostly due to a warming climate, we had drier fuels, and that probably made the fires a lot bigger and more intense. And as far as the future goes, we do anticipate that the Santa Ana winds probably will be a little bit drier going forward, and we will have bigger swings between wet and dry years. So these dry years will intensify, and that will probably lead to more events like this. So unfortunately, this is likely to become, more common going forward.
Thank you so much, Alex. As we've been dealing with these fast-spreading wildfires, we've also been dealing with fast-spreading misinformation that's been really challenging during our crisis for our leaders and operational folks working on the fire. Some of that has been related to urban water systems. So Greg, could you help our audience better understand a little bit about LA's urban water systems as it relates to this crisis?
For sure. And again, like you said, I don't think we've seen anything like the desire for information and the spread of misinformation and disinformation that's certainly been politicized around how water supply systems are supposed to fight wildfires. And, the first thing I'd say is that from all accounts, and we've asked and talked to many people, and I'm sure my co-panelists here could also weigh in, no amount of water, in general terms, could have stopped these wildfires. Secondly, it's really important to understand that urban water systems are not designed to fight wildfires. They are designed to fight sort of urban or structural everyday fires, but the expectation on them traditionally has not been to be able to fight wildfires. I think those expectations have changed or are changing as we speak in some regions. The third is that the evidence is still coming out, but as far as I've seen, again, as far as everyone I know and talk to, has been quoted on this, who really knows how water supply systems work. There isn't any damning evidence of mismanagement or lack of capacity compared to what we'd expect with most of these water systems in the region. I know there's been a lot of discussion, unprecedented levels of discussion around specific parts of, fire hydrants, tanks, reservoirs, pipelines, sprinkler systems. And I do think there are improvements we can make everywhere, certainly with vigilance, but also, again, with investment in those spaces. I also think it's important to know that it's definitely urban water supply systems, or any water supply system to fight a wildfire. It's not just about raw water, certainly not just about raw water in the region, water supply. It's about water supply, but it's about hyper-local infrastructure everywhere to hold it and move it. And it's really also about power to move it. And water is stubbornly it's heavy and subject to laws of physics. And it's really difficult to fight a wildfire, especially when systems are getting deteriorated and private property, is drawing down the system. There's a lot more to say, happy to address detailed questions in the Q&A, but that would be sort of a summary of what I think folks should understand.
Thank you so much. That's really helpful. A lot of people, obviously care deeply about these issues, but maybe don't have a lot of background in how urban water systems work and the kind of pressure issues that you're discussing. So that helps a lot. As these fires reach higher percentage containment, a lot of the focus is on the hazards that are left behind, which Yifang, you already alluded to. So let's dig in a bit more on that. A lot of the questions that came from our audience were air quality related. So many people are very concerned how we can determine whether our homes and our communities are safe to live and breathe in. So first, is it true that AQI measurements are sort of necessary but not sufficient to detect what we're dealing with in terms of toxins? And are there other publicly available information that you trust and turn to assess risk, especially in figuring out how far away from the immediate fire impacted areas people should be concerned?
Well, thank you for that question. I also got a lot of the similar questions. So I think first I'd like just to clarify what is AQI. So the AQI is an index developed by US EPA for 5 major air pollutants that are regulated by EPA, that including ozone, PM, including both PM 2.5, PM 10, carbon monoxide, sulfur dioxide, and nitrogen dioxide. So those pollutants were selected because by themselves, they're toxic, and also because they represent other pollutants. Oftentimes, they're coming from similar sources, but those pollutants are not routinely measured or regulated by EPA. So it's a quick and easy way, the AQI, to see if the air quality is safe to go outside or if precautions are needed. In Los Angeles, the most concerning pollutants that we're facing are PM 2.5 and ozone. And PM 2.5 is a year-round issue. Ozone is more of a summer issue. So during wildfire, the PM 2.5 is typically the primary driver of the AQI. So with all of those context in mind, then we can think about whether we should trust EQI, what the EQI really reflects. There are some good sources, like federal references sources, links that provide trustworthy AQI measurements, that including US EPA's AirNow website. South Coast Air Quality Management District also provide their own AQI measurements and also projection. So those are all available on their websites. And when there's conditions such as in a fire, wind is changing very quickly, the fire emissions that is very dynamic, I sometimes also use local sensor network data, just because they provide real-time data. AQI is often averaged over a certain period of time. So those low-cost air sensor, including purple air and fire and smoke might under the AirNow. So those are available for public to use to get reasonable information, good information about AQI. I do want to mention that local sensor individually has issues, and then they can be off because they're not really federal reference. But when you see a cluster of sensors, local sensors are all reading green or all reading purple, that really is helpful. That information is actually very helpful. So I found often another source that I use during the fires is called Watch Duty app. I found it's very helpful because it provides like additional information. It provides where the fires are, where are the evacuation zones, the AQI overlay based on some sensor data, and then wind direction and wind speed, among any other factors. I think the feature that allow this one app to overlay all those information into one map is really provide a more comprehensive view of the situation. So you can see if you're upwind or downwind from a fire, and you can see how strong the wind goes, and then you can see if the AQI in your area is good or bad. So all of those pieces come together if the data makes sense, and they can help people to make decisions if the air is good or bad. So does the AQI reflect other things? Like, for example, things I heard a lot of people concerns about lead or asbestos. Yes and no. For things that is in the air, again, AQI measures, remember, major pollutants like PM2.5. So they don't directly measure asbestos or lead or any other heavy metals or volatile organic compounds that can also come from the fire. But AQI generally is reasonable to rely on during fires because just think about the concentration of all those pollutants. They all come from the fire, right? Such as PM2.5, and they correlate very well with each other. For those pollutants that we don't measure, their concentration should go up and down with PM2.5 because they get diluted by the same amount of air once they get transported downwind. So this is something just to keep in mind. Like for example, the metal components, or they're part of the PM2.5. The metal components is usually a certain proportion of the PM2.5 mass. And similarly, if the asbestos is airborne, they're also fine particles. So they go up and down with PM2.5 concentrations. So if your AQI is good, then the airborne level of metal and asbestos levels should also be low. So I want people to get that message. Don't go panic if just thinking about the asbestos and the lead in addition to the PM2.5. But there's one thing to really note though during the fire, especially during the fires, is because there's gas pollutants, gas phase pollutants, and the particle phase pollutants. Again, the AQI reflects PM2.5 is a particle phase pollutant, right? Particles have additional mechanism to settle out from the air. They can deposit onto surfaces, so their concentration go down a little bit faster, quicker than the air phase pollutants, right? So there are situations especially during active fire where you can see the AQI is good, but one can still smell the smoke. You know, I actually had the experience during the first few days of the Panelist fire. I was out on campus or near my house where the AQI looks green, but I can smell the smoke. So this could indicate the presence of a gas phase or volatile organic compounds. So if you can smell it, you need to be mindful, and because it indicates that you are still being exposed to the fire smoke, even if the AQI appears favorable, just because they don't measure everything. So in such case, I think it's better to take precaution and stay indoors. But for the cycle ash, I think we also get lots of questions on that. AQI doesn't really cover that, right? It doesn't really reflect what is in the cycle ashes. So if you see visible ash in your neighborhood, it could contain lead or asbestos or other air toxics. I think the best approach is to avoid disturbing those ash to make it to prevent it from resuspend and get into the air, become airborne, so people can inhale it. So that can help reduce the inhalation risk. And if you are engaged in some cleaning, and that's where the precaution really have to come in, right? Try to use wet methods, damp clothes, mopping, wiping, and wear appropriate personal protection equipment, such as goggles, gloves, masks, or respirators, if you are really the workforce heavily involved in cleaning up those wildfire ruins. And another question I think I hear is like how far the smoke can impact, right? And then we should worry like how far away, and people wants to get a magic distance. There's no such a magic distance because it highly depends on the meteorological factors such as wind direction, whether you are upwind or downwind from the fire, or the atmospheric conditions, is this very open air, or there's an air is very stagnant, how ventilation goes, how quickly the pollutant sources can get diluted. So if you're upwind, even you are pretty close to the source, your air could still be good. I think everyone will witness this during the strong north and northeastern wind. At UCLA campus is actually upwind of the Panelist fire. So the air looks actually okay because we're upwind, even we're close, right? But if you're downwind, then you really have to worry about the smoke, and you really have to be vigilant about the smell of the smoke. Even some of the AQIs may be okay. So for example, PM 2.5. PM 2.5 can stay in the air for quite a bit of time. Like they can stay for weeks or days, depending again on the factors like weather, atmosphere stability, or the deposition removal processes. During wildfire, PM 2.5 can transport over long distance, sometimes over 100 miles. So they can impact regions that are far away from the source. But it's very important to keep in mind that as those particles transport, right, from with the wind, they are rapidly diluted by the surrounding airs, so reducing their concentrations with distance away from the fire. So overall, I think the message I want to deliver is if the AQI is good and you don't smell the smoke and you're not directly downwind from the fire, all of those information you can get from Watch Duty app, then I think it's okay. It's okay to go outside. It's okay to enjoy your life.
Thank you so much.
I'll turn it back to you. Yeah.
Yeah, that's such a helpful and comprehensive answer. And you mentioned a few protective measures, wearing PPE when you're dealing with the ash and wetting it down. You talked about staying indoors when the air qualities are really bad. But do you have any other sort of recommendations for the community to protect themselves? Should we be masking outside? We've heard about N95s or using air filters inside our homes. Should pets be kept inside? These were some of the questions we got. And then what about homes that don't have climate control and actually rely on opening the windows? Should they be worried? Is there anything they can do?
That's a very good question. Again, the indoor air quality is really important in the context of fires. I think during those acute fires, if you are downwind, you're in the plume, your AQI outside is really bad, definitely stay indoors. And there you definitely need to take precaution measures, right? If this is really the air, the AQI turns like a purple or red, you want to seal your windows, your doors, you keep them closed. If you have a HVAC system in your home, you keep it running and make sure you have more 13 above filters installed in your system so that can help to filter out some of those outdoor particles gas in. The stay indoor offer two aspects, two benefits. One is to cut down the amount of pollutants from outdoor transport into indoors, right? And the second is that when we stay indoor, we tend to be doing quiet things, not going out and exercise, running, all of that. So that reduce the amount of air also take in. So that reduce exposure and protect health. So if you're living in a like space where you don't have a HVAC system and relies on ventilation, natural ventilation, I think during the extreme fire events, when the AQI outside is bad, you want to maybe create a clean indoor space. This can be done by using portable air purifiers. So make sure you use those HEPA filter, high efficiency particulate filter based air cleaners. There are other cleaners that could potentially also generate other pollutants. So make sure you use those HEPA based ones. And then that can help. And also be mindful, indoor spaces can also have their own sources, right? During those extreme events, you also want to limit the amount of pollutant that you put inside your living spaces, like also cooking and smoking and other like vacuum stuff, right? So that can help overall reduce exposure. But once the air, the AQI, as I mentioned, turns good and you don't smell anything, it's okay to open window and get the ventilation. Oftentimes, we actually encourage when the outdoor air quality is good to have ventilation because there's many indoor sources also contributing to a healthy fast. And speaking of that, I think it also needs to be very careful because the past could potentially bring those dust back to the home and that can cause secondary exposure. So it needs to be mindful on those regards as well.
Thank you so much. I know that our community really appreciates your guidance right now as we're dealing with these, toxic pollutants. You know, another area that came up as a major area of concern is, of course, how these toxins and pollutants are affecting our water supply. You know, areas that were directly impacted by fire are still under do not drink notices. So I'm going to turn to Greg for a few and just get a bit more perspective on that. You know, what should we be thinking about when it comes to water quality in light of the fires? How can we protect ourselves? What are the good sources for accurate information? And then just thinking about people's homes, some of the questions they had were, how should they deal with swimming pools that may have been polluted by ash? And will it be safe to go in the ocean? And in general, how fires are affecting water supply in Los Angeles.
Yeah, so I'll try to tackle that in just a few minutes. I think I'm going to start with good news, bad news, good news. The good news is, I really want to stress this first and foremost. If you're not, trying to drink water in an area that burned, or an area right next to an area that burned that's in an evacuation zone, if you don't have a notice from your drinking water system, you aren't close to any of those zones, you should not have any new concern about your drinking water quality due to these fires. There are other ways that the whole region's water supply is being affected by these fires in terms of when it rains, stormwater runoff, and potential surface water and groundwater impacts. But most of the systems, the vast majority of systems in the county drinking water systems, again, we have 200, the drinking water quality hasn't changed due to the fires. The bad news, especially, hearing my colleague again talk about air quality, is that drinking water quality cannot be boiled down to an AQI-like measure. There is no equivalent. We have about 100 things that we actually track at a minimum in drinking water quality, every water system in the country. And there's also no easy way besides getting, having a water system or getting a lab certified test to really get accurate information about your drinking water. Turning back to some of the good news, I think, as far as I've seen, again, the water systems that are under do not drink and boil water notices, and there are 8 to 10 that are at various stages of that right now, are doing their best to get out information and to update information and to be able to remove those notices as soon as they can. Each of those water systems, has to comply with state standards. The State Water Board, basically, our drinking water regulator, depending on the conditions that they faced. And there are impacts to some of these systems that occurred both due to loss of power, loss of pressure that affects water quality generally, as well as in some cases there are, and we're still trying to figure out, where there are actual impacts to the drinking water infrastructure through burning that lead to things you normally don't see in water, specific types of volatile organic compounds or metals and carcinogens. I'm optimistic, and we're already starting to see some of the do not drink notices being lifted, that will occur, especially in the large systems in the coming days and weeks. But you really, first and foremost, have to rely on the information from the systems themselves and from the state and eventually the county providing oversight on that guidance. That being said, I think there is quite a bit of good work coming out of LA Times and LAist trying to provide sort of user-friendly guides to how to navigate, how you interpret those notices from systems, because they are in relatively technical language. But generally, if you're under a do not drink and boil water notice, you do need to rely on alternative water sources, bottled water, which I know is being provided in many areas, until those orders are lifted. I think what's a bigger concern, and is going to be a long haul, is around the impacts for folks, maybe some of who have already moved back or will be building back in the future, around impacts to your drinking water quality that aren't the water system's responsibility because they've affected your private plumbing or the pipes on your property. And the pipes on your property, if you own property, are kind of your responsibility. And there are more impacts that we see because of the different types of pipes used to those pipes. They tend to burn more easily and leach more easily. So in those cases, if you're building back, regardless, or you're re-inhabiting in a burned area, you do need to have your water tested. It has to be lab certified. There are some options for that. Perhaps we can provide some resources and follow-up materials. But you have to test. Again, in most cases, there shouldn't be an issue unless your actual structure burned. Then you really need to be careful. But you can get the tests back. In some cases, you'll have to replace that infrastructure too. There's going to be no other option if it's burned or really leached. But in many cases, it's a matter of flushing out the water and using an additional filter, and it can, still be as healthy as it was before. That's a flyby overview. Just quickly on the other questions you asked. I think in terms of ocean impacts, for sure, there are going to be, beach impacts both to the ocean water and to, in some cases, limited cases, depending on where like wastewater and stormwater is disposed to sand. But it's really, that is starting to occur, but it'll really be worse, and you'll have to be careful and just follow the notices that do go out around beach closures when it starts to rain and there starts to be runoff, as we say, out into the ocean. But you'll just have to follow those notices. Can't say actually, how long those notices will continue, but it'll probably be, well, especially if it doesn't rain much, it'll be through a number of different rain events for sure. In terms of pool water, what I've seen, I'm not a pool water expert, but it's essentially that you don't need to drain your pool. You want to strain it, and you want to make sure you have sort of all the types of balance you normally want in a pool, particularly pH and others. But you don't need to take drastic measures probably to drain your pool. You just need to clean it and sort of dredge it, and you should be relatively good to go. It's a lot more to say, but I want to turn it back over to you.
Yeah, appreciate that. Thank you. And that's a good segue. You've talked a little bit about runoff into the ocean. We've talked about the way that these ashes and pollutants and toxins can travel. So I want to turn back to Alex. Thankfully, we have some very much needed rain in the forecast this weekend. That should help with these fire conditions, but it brings its own challenges. And would appreciate if you could share a bit more for us about the kind of complex challenges that arise with these greater extremes that we're seeing between rain and fire, and what some of those impacts might be.
Yeah, I mean, fire and water are the two big extremes that we deal with in California. And I guess the story really starts with the two extreme wet years that we had previous to the current year, where we had a lot of extra precipitation, much more than normal, and that produced probably a buildup of fuels in the vegetation in our chaparral landscapes, and that probably was a factor behind the extreme nature of these fires. Just that not only were they so dry, as I talked about a little bit earlier, but there was also extra fuel buildup from the extremely wet years that we had previously. So there's a connection there between what we're getting from the sky and the intensity of our wildfires. And then following a fire, as you were hinting at there, Narit, there's a risk of debris flow when we do have rain, and that's because the land is denuded of vegetation, and vegetation plays an anchoring effect in soils. And when we have wildfires and then we have a big rain event, we can have mudslides. And that happened, for example, in the wet year of 2017, 2018, we had some really intense wildfires in the fall and winter. And then we had some spectacular mudslides after that in Montecito, for example. So we have to really be on the lookout now for heavy rain events. The rain event that we're about to get, fortunately, I think is very beneficial in that it will help us to end the wildfire season, thankfully. And I don't think it's quite enough to fully end it, but it will definitely go some way towards ending the wildfire season. And it's not big enough to pose a risk, I don't think, for debris flow. But if we get a big rain event, like a 1 or 2 incher in a day or more, then we really are at risk for debris flow or mudslides in those areas that were affected by the fires. And fortunately, that's quite a large area. So that's our next challenge.
Definitely. And I know our incident command and leaders from the state we're gathering on exactly that topic to prepare for potential impacts from the rains this weekend. So really appreciate those perspectives. We want to keep us moving along. I know we are only going to have a little bit of time left for some additional questions. As we're gathering the questions that have been submitted, I want to pose a question to all of you as a panel. You know, we talked a little bit about misinformation that's out there, and you know, as we're dealing with these complex systems and complex challenges, a data-informed, science-informed perspective is so important. So would love if you could share with us a little bit about what the important research is right now. What kind of samples are imperative to collect? What kind of research can UCLA researchers work on that's going to help us track these health impacts or make the most informed decisions about how we build our communities back? And any of you can start.
I'll jump in quickly. Yeah, so I talked about this a little bit earlier, but I'm really interested in the relationship between ignitions and Santa Ana wind events, and I think that we really need to learn more about the origins of these fires. I think the other piece of this is that these were human in origin because we don't really have natural ignitions this time of year, and so I think there are lessons learned there in terms of wildfire prevention, because we probably could have prevented these fires if we had taken the right measures. And so I think understanding how ignitions relate to Santa Ana wind events and how we can have better measures in place to prevent wildfires and ignitions when we know that there are certain types of Santa Ana wind events that are going to occur. I think that's one pathway we have towards more resilience going forward, is just doing a better job with managing our ignitions and predicting the Santa Ana wind events.
Thank you. Greg or Yifang? I know, Yifang, you talked about some samples you're currently already collecting. Is there more you want to say about that?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think other than in my own research interest, I think there's also needs to start to track short-term and long-term health effects from among those who are directly impacted during the extreme events. So there are, people that are being heavily impacted during the active fires, and then potentially can move back and maybe exposed to the degassing for quite a bit of time. And I think one of the particular vulnerable populations is the workers who are actually going to go back and to clean up those ashes that get burned down. And then those are really important groups to keep in mind. And I think the society government also has the obligation to provide protections, educations, informations to help mitigate those exposures at all costs. And I also think there's just like a general overall how the community will rebuild. I think this is beyond this panel, but in my mind, I think many people lost their homes. There's lots of mental health issues, how the society or UCLA can play a role to support the community rebuilding. I think those are very important questions. Some of them really beyond my research areas, but I think the community really needs those resources and support.
Thank you. Greg, how about you? What do you see as the research priorities when it comes to water?
Yeah, really, it's the four things I started with. The first is more of a translational piece, but really helping folks understand. We're working on sort of numerous ways of doing this, including talking to everyone we can, but also sort of report and FAQ style documents. How does a water supply system work? How do fire hydrants work? What are water tanks? How quickly can we move water? Those sorts of questions I think have largely been assumed that, folks knew, but I think there's a newfound interest in them. The second is sort of primary research, but also translation in the drinking water quality space. I think there's a role that researchers do tend to play in these more recent fires that have affected drinking water systems, to help explain and communicate in ways that agencies, journalists, and nonprofits can't from a university perspective. So we're working on that front. Then really when it comes to more sort of pure research that we do in the School of Public Affairs, we're looking again at best practices. How can small and medium-sized water systems be better equipped? Can they be better equipped to fight wildfires? How should regulation play a role? How should financing play a role? And then the final piece is, really from a political and economic perspective, how can we pay for major improvements? How can we pay for building back? How much should we pay? Who should pay? Those sorts of questions are both long-term but immediate, with the fires in the various jurisdictions, and again, sort of voices out there about what the future shape of Los Angeles should look like.
Thank you. You know, we've talked a little bit about some of the ways that toxins can affect our water quality. Do you have anything to add in terms of airborne particles and how they might get into the water supply, either Greg or Yifang? That's a question that's come up from a number of different folks in the chat.
Greg, you want to take that? I think from my perspective, the particles that can suspend it can actually deposit gas into the water system. There are definitely potential connections between what is in the air and then what's gas into the water.
And Greg, I know a lot of the water that is, you know, exposed to air then goes through treatment. Do you feel that's, you know, addressing this, or anything to add there?
Yeah, I mean, what Yifang said, but more broadly, there's just a lot of, to use a technical term, junk that's coming from everything that's burned. Some of it's, you know, was hazardous before, hazardous materials, but any type of plastic burning, all sorts of chemicals and heavy metals. So most of that's going to come from sort of surface runoff, not from the air, but the air is not going to help. I do expect and believe, and there are standards in place that really all of the drinking water systems are going to treat the water to standards that makes it, you know, healthy to drink, and folks should be able to trust that. When it comes to source water, that's eventually going to make its way into the drinking water systems. But all of that places a strain, both in terms of energy, sometimes in terms of technology, but mostly in terms of cost. It's just more expensive to treat the water now, and that's going to be a reality for quite some time.
Thank you. Alex, there's been a lot of questions about prevention as it relates to the landscape. Could you talk a little bit about what you're seeing in terms of brush clearance? We know this was a firestorm with 100-mile-per-hour winds. We also know that brush clearance can be complex, and sometimes too much clearance can make way for very flammable invasives. So do we have any lessons learned there yet from these fires?
Yeah, I mean, I think this goes back to the misinformation issue because a lot of people assume that our landscapes around us are forests, and even in the national media, people refer to these as forests, but they're not forests. And in our forests, we have a strategy to reduce wildfire risk, which is to do controlled burns and reduce the fuel load. But that does not apply to our chaparral shrublands around here. Basically they burn kind of no matter what, if there's a Santa Ana wind event and there's an ignition event, and it makes very little difference, you know, if we do controlled burns or vegetation clearance. In fact, that can be destructive. You hinted at that a little bit, Nurit, because it can make the way for invasive grasses, which are even more flammable. Typically, they're also invasive, you know, plants that are not native to our region. So that really does also harm the ecosystem, which we have to remember is also a stakeholder in this conversation, even though it can't talk. So I think that, you know, we have to focus instead of, I think, you know, creating defensible space around homes and structures, for sure. That's a way in which vegetation clearance is really valuable and important and part of the resilience strategy. But in our wildlands, you know, I think we have to adopt different strategies, probably, you know, focused again on ignitions prevention and preventing invasive grasses from taking root in our landscapes.
Thank you so much. There's a great resource, which maybe will get shared in the chat, that a UCLA IoES student actually worked on when they were with RCD along with CAL FIRE, which is defensiblespace.org. And that really talks about how to utilize native landscaping and sustainable landscaping that's fire resistant in your home. So that can be a good resource for everyone on that topic. Yifang, we mentioned that the rain is coming and the challenges that will come with that, but some of our attendees here tonight are wondering if that will help with air quality. Do we think things will clear out a bit with the rain that we might have this weekend?
No, I think Alex already mentioned that we're actually very much looking forward to some rains, and the rain can do two things. One is to mitigate the fires themselves, and second, they can like we call wet deposition, can bring down a lot of those suspended particles in the air to the ground. And maybe for the water people may have to worry about the surface runout into the ocean, but it definitely can help with the fire and the air.
Thank you so much. Well, hopefully this weekend will bring some respite for our firefighters who have been working so hard, and for many of us. We really appreciate you all joining us tonight, and I'm going to give it to Alex for some closing remarks. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Nurit. I want to thank you for helping us move through this conversation, and I also want to thank my co-panelists again for this very informative discussion. Greg and Yifang, I just learned so much from you both. So our goal here was just to start an ongoing conversation. I know we all have many more questions, especially about how we can rebuild more resilient communities in the wake of this disaster. And we do have many UCLA experts who are currently in the field. Yifang already talked a little bit about this, who are gathering data to answer a number of these questions. And we really look forward to seeing the outcomes of their research. We'll continue to gather questions from the community, and we will continue to put together these types of events, and we may have a series of events, we'll see, to address the complex issues around risk and rebuilding as we start down the long road to recovery. I welcome everyone here to help us continue the dialogue. Please let us know what your questions and concerns are. You can always email us at sustainablela@conet.ucla.edu or visit sustainablela.ucla.edu to learn more. Thank you all again, and I hope you and your families stay safe in these challenging times.